Hello Moralis community, my name is Joseph and I am your Web3 instructor. Now in this video, I want to show you how you can get all ERC20 transfers by a wallet address. Now this endpoint is part of the Token API, which makes it very powerful if you want to create dapps that track, collect and display data of different transfers for a wallet address. Now, as always, before we dive into the documentation or the code, let me actually demonstrate to you how the app actually works. And the app itself is built with Next.js for Frontend, and I've used a Node Express server for the backend to make the API calls. So let's paste the wallet address in there and choose Ethereum for this example. Once we hit submit, we see the data that we want to display. In our case, we want to display the date of the transaction itself and which block number it happened in, from which address and to which address, and then the transaction hash, which you can copy, go to Etherscan and get more data of this transaction. So let's jump into the documentation. This is the documentation for using the SDK, and from here we can install Moralis, which we're going to need. But I want to get to the documentation for the API endpoint itself. So let's go to the bottom and hit this get wallet token transfers link. So this gets us to the API documentation instead, which we have a lot more data and parameters that we can use in this documentation. We're going to use Node, so hit that link. Otherwise, if you have another backend language that you want to use, you can choose your own preferences from here. So let's paste the address we used in the previous example in the application itself in this input field. And as you can see, address is the only required parameter, but we have other ones as well. You can use the chain parameter, which we are going to use. If you leave this empty, by default, it's gonna be the Ethereum. Then you can, if you want to get data for a specific block or from a block to a block, you can input these two parameters as well. Or if you want to narrow it down, you can use dates instead. We're not going to use those two, but then you also have limit and cursor if that's interesting to you. So once we have pasted this one, let's choose Ethereum here as well and try it out. And below this section, we will see the results that are coming back. In our case, 127 transactions, which are the same we saw in the application. Now this is the data that's coming back. You have the value, you have the to and from address that we showed as well. You have the block hash, the block number, timestamp, and then you also have the address, which is basically in which address this transaction happened in. We're not going to use this one, but this is very powerful because this value here is in this address currency. So you can combine this endpoint very well with the get price endpoint and then calculate the USD price and display that instead if you want that. We're not going to use this for this example, so let's stick to this endpoint instead. Now, with this said, if this is interesting enough, let me show you the code that makes this application work. Now, in Visual Studio Code, you can see that I have a root folder. And then within that one, I have two folders, one for the backend and one for the front end. Now let's start with the backend and with package.json because I have installed a few dependencies that you will have to install as well. One being course, the second one .env, which we're going to use because we don't want to display our API key. We wanted to keep it private. Express because it's going to be our server that's making the API calls. And then Moralis because we need that to make the API calls. Now inside index.js, we need to start our Express server and we need to first set the port of the server, in my case 5001. Then we need to require Moralis and also course because if we want to send parameters from the client, the front-end side to the backend and then use those parameters for an API call, we need to use course for us to allow this to happen. And then we need to require .env because that's where we have our API key. So instead of having our API key straight up front in here, we're gonna create a .env file in the backend folder. And into that one, I have chosen Moralis API key as my variable name. You can change this one if you want to, and then paste your API key here. Now, if you don't have an API key already, make sure you go to moralis.io and create your free account by clicking here. Once you've done that, you can log in to your own page, go to Web3 APIs, and there you have your API key. We can copy this one, but make sure you keep this private. It's your own. So let's go back and paste that in here, save this file, and then we can close it. Now back in index, we need to use the process.env keywords and then our variable name that we chose in the .env file. Now we're going to use this one in the bottom because that's where we are starting our server, and using the Moralis start function, which will let us make the API calls, we're going to use our API key as a parameter. Now for this server, I have only created one endpoint, which is the /transfers, and it is a get endpoint, a get request that we're going to make using the required parameters from our client side. So using Moralis and EVM API, we can use the get wallet token transfer endpoint, add our address and our chain that we got from the front end, and make this request to the API. Now, if the API call is successful, we just want to send the response back to the front end. If not, we want to display that something went wrong and the error message itself. Now, let's assume that everything went good, and now we can go to the front end instead. I'm gonna minimize this one and close this one so we can focus on the front end. In here, we can start with package.json. I have installed Axios because that's what we're going to use to make our call to the backend server. And you can also install the React Select library, which will let you create beautiful and very simple drop-down menus. Now, in our index.js, because that's our home page, and in here we're rendering two components, one being the header, and if we go to that one, we can see that it's the logo on the top left corner, and then the title. The second component we're rendering is main, so let's jump straight into that one. And here we can see that we are importing both Axios and React Select, and then that's where everything is happening for our application. So talking about React Select, in our case, as you saw, we have three values: Ethereum, Guerli, and Mumbai. And the values, in order for us to use these values in our API call, we need to set them like this. And this is the chain ID for each and every network of these. Now, if you don't want to use these ones, if you want to use more or others instead, you can go to moralis.io/docs/cross-chain requests. And here you can see different networks and their provided chain ID that you can use. Now let's go back to the code. We have added some styling as well to our dropdown. Now for this application to work, we obviously want to show the results. But once the user hit the submit button, not before. So we have a variable called showResult, and that's set to false. We have the result itself, we have the chain value, and then we have the address as well. The chain value gets updated once you hit the drop-down menu and then choosing your preferred chain. But what is happening when we hit the submit button? That's when we run the handle submit function. So in here, first of all, we want to take the value from the input field. The input field itself has an ID called wallet address. So we can choose that one with query selector and then extract the value and store it into address. And then we take the value of the chain value that we chosen above and store that into chain. Now with these two variables, we can do a GET request to our backend server, which was on port 5001/transfers, because that was the endpoint we created. And then we're passing these two parameters to that. And then in the backend server, we're taking these parameters out and we're using them once again to make a request to the Moralis API. Now, once we get the response back to the backend server and it's gonna come back to the front end, then we just want to console log that, and I will show you how it looks like in the application. So let's open the console inspector, open this object that we're getting back. And here in data, we can see that this pretty much looks like the response we saw in the documentation. You have the total number of transactions, and then you also have the result, which is one index for every transaction. And if we're opening the first one up, we can see that we have the exact same data. We have the address, we have the block hash, number, timestamp, from and to address, the transaction hash, and the value. Now, let's go back to the code and see how we are actually using this data to make this look like this. So we don't need all that data. We actually only need .data.result, which is this whole array right here. So we're setting that to result. Now that we actually have the result, we want to set show result to true, and then we want to empty the input field and the drop down menu. Below all this is where we are rendering everything. So we have the form, which includes an input field and the drop down menu. Then we have our submit button, and below the submit button we have this section where we are showing the results. So we have the array with all the results. This makes it very easy for us because we can map through that array and display each and every data that we want to show. So in the result container, I have included two sections, one being the result container header and the other one being for the data. This is just to make it look a little bit more beautiful, separate two parts in this section. So the header includes the time and the block number, and then the data container includes the from and to address, and then the transaction hash. Now, the timestamp, we want to show the date itself. We don't need the actual time of it, so that's why we're splitting it like this. And what's cool about this, you can evolve this application. You can maybe link to Etherscan with this specific transaction hash and make each and every transaction hash in the data container a link for the user to click and see even more data about this transfer. Now, let's go back to the application so I can show it to you once again. Let me close this one. I'm gonna refresh the page. Let's go back here and use this same address. Paste that in. In this case, let's do Gwirly instead. Hit submit. And we're gonna see that in this case, we only have 3 transactions, but we have the same data. We have the time, we have the block number, from, to, and the transaction hash. Now let's do the same with Mumbai, and you will see that we have a few more than Gwirly, but not nearly as much as for the Ethereum main network. Now we can also, as I said before, you can copy this transaction hash and go to etherscan.io, paste that in. This didn't work. Let's go back to the application. This happened. Let's actually do this instead. Let's take the address again. Do Ethereum, take this one, paste that in, and there we have it. Because Mumbai is on Polygon, so this one is for Ethereum, so that's why we can see this data. And from here, you can see the block number, which is ending by 702. If we go back to the application, 702, that's the exact same. We can see the from and the to. We can see how much. 450, and you have that number. We're not displaying it, but we're having it right here in the console log as well. There we have it. So as I said before, this endpoint works very good with the get price endpoint, so you can combine these two and build a bigger dapp. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will share the code in GitHub and below this video so you can find that out. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button and also subscribe, because we share a ton of similar Web3 videos using Moralis. I hope I will see you in the next one.